The sun was setting over Maplewood Heights, casting a golden glow on the rows of identical houses, each framed by freshly trimmed hedges and immaculately mowed lawns. It was a neighborhood that prided itself on order, where even the birds seemed to chirp in synchronized harmony. But beneath this serene exterior, a storm was quietly brewing. At the far end of Chestnut Lane, where the streetlights flickered to life one by one, lived Harold Jenkins. A disabled veteran who had served 2 tours overseas, Harold maneuvered his wheelchair slowly down the cracked concrete path of his front yard. His worn hands gripped the wheels with a steady resolve, his eyes scanning the garden with a mixture of pride and frustration. Harold's yard was different from the others. The grass was patchy in places, wildflowers grew untamed near the fence, and a faded American flag fluttered gently beside a small display of his military medals on a weathered wooden table. To Harold, it was a sanctuary, a living memory of sacrifice and resilience. To Karen Whitman, president of the Maplewood Heights Homeowners Association, it was an eyesore threatening the perfect image of the community. Karen was a woman, known as much for her polished smile as for her iron will. She wielded the HOA's rules like a weapon, enforcing regulations with ruthless precision. No leaf out of place, no paint color off by a shade. To her, the neighborhood was a pristine canvas, and Harold's yard was a blotch that needed to be scrubbed clean. That afternoon, Karen had made her rounds, clipboard in hand, marking down minor infractions on neighbors' properties. But when she reached Harold's home, her lips curled into a cold, tight line. She lingered longer than usual, her eyes darting over every inch of the uneven lawn and personal decorations. The neighbors noticed the unusual tension in the air as Karen's gaze hardened. "Property values," Karen muttered under her breath, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. She was already drafting the letter she planned to send Harold, a letter that would demand immediate action to restore community standards. She would warn him that failure to comply would lead to fines and possibly legal action. Across the street, Mrs. Dalton, a retired schoolteacher, watched the scene unfold with growing unease. "That woman's gone too far this time," she whispered to her husband. "Harold's done more for this country than Karen ever will, and she's treating him like a criminal." The HOA board meetings had always been a source of quiet dread for Harold. Whenever Karen called one, she wielded her authority like a hammer, hammering down complaints with no room for discussion. Yet Harold, despite his physical challenges, had never lost his dignity or his calm demeanor. That evening, as the neighborhood settled into its usual quiet routine, the first ominous sign appeared. An official-looking envelope, embossed with the HOA's seal, slid under Harold's front door. Harold picked it up with trembling fingers. The letter inside was cold, clinical, and unyielding. "Dear Mr. Jenkins, it has come to the attention of the Homeowners Association that your property fails to meet the community's standards, specifically regarding lawn maintenance and the display of unauthorized decorations. These issues have been deemed detrimental to the overall property values and aesthetic harmony of Maplewood Heights. You are hereby requested to remedy these violations within 7 days or face escalating penalties, including but not limited to fines and potential legal action." Harold read the letter twice, his heart sinking. The phrase "property values" echoed in his mind like a relentless drumbeat. It was clear. Karen's campaign against him had begun, and there would be no mercy. Outside, the streetlights flickered, again casting long shadows over the pristine lawns. For all its outward perfection, Maplewood Heights was a neighborhood on the brink. And Harold Jenkins, veteran, neighbor, and unlikely battleground, was at its very center. Harold sat at his kitchen table, the letter from the HOA spread before him like a cold verdict. The fluorescent light above hummed softly, casting a sterile glow over the cluttered space. Photos of his family and medals from his military service were scattered across the table, silent witnesses to the battle he now faced. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, rattling the window panes. Despite his physical limitations, Harold was determined to respond, not with anger but with quiet dignity. He knew the rules of the HOA, but he also knew that Karen's demands were more than about lawn care. They were about control. The next morning, Harold wheeled himself outside, his worn gloves gripping the chair's wheels. He began tending to the patchy grass as best as he could, trimming stray weeds with a small pair of shears. But his body betrayed him. Arthritis made every movement ache. Still, he refused to give in. That afternoon, a knock came at the door. Harold opened it to find Karen standing there, clipboard in hand, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Jenkins," she said sharply, "I came to inspect your progress. The HOA expects full compliance by the end of the week." Harold nodded slowly. "I'm doing my best, Karen. My health makes some things harder, but I'm trying." Karen's eyes flicked over to the faded flag hanging limply by the porch. "Also that flag and those medals. They're not approved decorations. They need to be removed. They're an eyesore, and frankly, they don't belong here." Harold's heart tightened. "They're my symbols of service. I won't take them down." Karen's smile was thin, almost cruel. "Then the fines begin." After she left, Harold felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. But what surprised him most was the sudden shift among his neighbors. Some offered quiet support, a sympathetic nod, a wave, but others seemed wary, avoiding eye contact. The community Karen ruled with an iron fist was dividing. That evening, as Harold wheeled himself around the block for fresh air, he noticed something unsettling. Across the street, a figure lurked near the bushes outside Karen's house, watching him. When their eyes met, the figure vanished into the shadows. Was Karen watching him, or was there something more sinister afoot? The next day, Harold's mailbox was stuffed with more letters. This time, copies of HOA rules, warnings about fines, and a notice of an upcoming HOA board meeting where his violations would be discussed publicly. Word spread quickly, and tension in the neighborhood grew palpable. At the local grocery store, Harold overheard whispers. Some neighbors whispered about Karen's obsession. Others warned him to just comply or stay out of trouble. The community's fragile peace was cracking. On the evening of the EA board meeting, Harold arrived early, rolling into the packed community hall. The air was thick with murmurs and nervous glances. Karen sat at the head of the table, radiating authority, while a few HOA members exchanged uneasy looks. As the meeting began, Karen wasted no time. She presented doctored photos of Harold's yard, highlighting imperfections and accusing him of willful neglect. She even played a video, grainy and distorted, showing close-ups of the flag and medals with ominous music added, casting them as disruptive elements. Harold stood to defend himself, his voice steady despite the weight of the accusations. "This isn't about property values," he said quietly. "It's about respect. For veterans, for neighbors, for human dignity." Karen cut him off sharply. "The HOA doesn't negotiate with rule breakers." Suddenly, the lights flickered, then plunged the room into darkness. Gasps and murmurs filled the air. A moment later, the emergency lights kicked on, casting eerie red glows on the faces of the gathered crowd. Whispers turned to fearful speculation. Was the blackout an accident, or a calculated move to intimidate Harold? Suspense gripped the room as everyone realized the battle for control was far from over, and that in Maplewood Heights, even the darkest nights held secrets waiting to surface. The blackout at the HOA meeting had shaken the neighborhood, but no one was prepared for what came next. Harold's unease deepened with each passing night. Strange noises echoed outside his home, soft footsteps on gravel, the faint hum of an engine idling in the distance. His gut told him someone was watching. Harold, A man trained to survive in hostile environments refused to be caught unprepared. With trembling hands, he set up a small security camera inside his living room window, aimed at the front yard. It was an old model, but it could capture movement in the dark. The following night, as rain drummed softly against the roof, Harold sat by his window, eyes fixed on the camera's grainy feed on his laptop. Hours passed with nothing but shadows, moving in the wind until suddenly a figure appeared. Karen. She moved cautiously, her silhouette sharp against the dim glow of the streetlights. Clad in a dark jacket, she seemed to be inspecting the yard, her flashlight beam cutting across patches of grass and the faded flag. At one point, she stopped and knelt down, marking the ground with red spray paint. Harold's heart pounded. What was she planning? Vandalism or worse? He quickly saved the footage, sending copies to a trusted neighbor, Mrs. Dalton, who had promised to watch out for him. But fear was no longer just about Karen's demands. It was about what lengths she was willing to go to enforce her control. The next day, Harold found a note slipped under his door, written in shaky handwriting. "Stop fighting us. This isn't about you. It's about the neighborhood. You're making it worse." No signature. Harold showed the note to Mrs. Dalton, whose eyes narrowed. "This goes beyond lawn disputes. Someone wants to scare you off." At the next HOA meeting, Harold confronted Karen with the surveillance footage. The room fell silent as the grainy video played on the projector. Karen's expression hardened, but her voice remained icy calm. "This is a private neighborhood," she said. "Inspections are part of my job." But the neighbors were restless. Whispers rose, concern mixed with fear. Several residents had noticed Karen's increasingly aggressive behavior, but none had dared speak openly. Harold's ally, a young mother named Lisa, stood up. "Karen's obsession is tearing us apart. We should be a community, not a battleground." Karen shot her a glare. "Watch your words, Lisa. This is about property values, and I will protect them at any cost." The room's atmosphere crackled like static. Everyone waited, breaths held, for what would come next. Later that week, Harold's mailbox contained another letter. This one a formal HOA complaint accusing him of harassment for the surveillance camera. Karen had filed it herself. The thin line between neighborly rules and personal vendetta blurred. That night, Harold's phone buzzed with an anonymous text. "You don't belong here. Leave before it's too late." He stared at the screen, his mind racing. Who was behind these threats? Karen? Someone working with her? Or an unseen enemy lurking in the shadows of Maplewood Heights? Despite the fear, Harold refused to back down. He knew the battle for his home had become a fight for his dignity, his safety, and the truth. As he rolled through his yard the next morning, the red spray paint still marking his grass burned like a brand. This was no longer just about lawn care or HOA rules. It was a war simmering beneath the perfect facade, and Harold Jenkins was determined to win. The community hall was packed to capacity when Harold wheeled in that evening. The air was thick, with anticipation and unease, like the calm before a storm. Faces lined the rows of folding chairs, some sympathetic, others wary, many steeling themselves for confrontation. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, cold and unyielding, casting long shadows that flickered on the scuffed linoleum floor. At the front, Karen Whitman sat smugly at the head of the table, surrounded by a small circle of loyal HOA board members. Her clipboard was stacked with documents, her laptop open and glowing with projected images ready to condemn Harold Jenkins. Harold took a deep breath, steeling his nerves. Despite the fear twisting in his gut, he was prepared to fight, not just for his lawn, but for his dignity and the respect every veteran deserved. Karen opened the meeting with practiced precision. "Good evening, neighbors. We're here to address a serious matter threatening our community's value and image." Her eyes locked on Harold. Mr. Jenkins has repeatedly failed to comply with HOA regulations. Today, we will review evidence of his violations." She clicked a button, and a slideshow burst onto the screen. Photos of Harold's yard appeared, some old, some recent, but with clear digital edits to exaggerate the damage. The grass was darker, the flowers wilted beyond reality. One image zoomed in on the American flag, bent and faded, accompanied by ominous music that Karen had sneakily inserted. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Karen's voice sliced through the tension. "These violations threaten every homeowner's investment. If Mr. Jenkins refuses to comply, we must take action to protect the neighborhood, starting with fines and possible eviction proceedings." Harold wheeled forward, his voice steady, but strong. "This isn't about property values. This is about a man's right to live in his own home with dignity. I served this country with honor, and I deserve respect, not threats." Karen's lips curled into a cold smile. "The rules are clear. No exceptions." Suddenly, the lights flickered violently, plunging the room into near darkness. The fluorescent buzz intensified into a piercing hum as panic flickered across the faces in the crowd. "What's going on?" someone whispered nervously. Then, like a switch flipped, the emergency red lights blinked on, casting eerie glows and long shadows. The power outage wasn't accidental. Karen's smile faltered for a moment, replaced by a flash of real anger. "Order!" she barked, trying to regain control, but the room was restless, whispers of suspicion spreading like wildfire. Harold's eyes searched the crowd, looking for allies. Lisa, the young mother who had spoken out before, nodded firmly. Others shifted, uneasily. Minutes passed like hours before the lights finally returned to normal. But the damage was done. Suspicion and fear had rooted themselves deep. As the meeting resumed, Karen doubled down, accusing Harold of staging the blackout to distract from his non-compliance. Harold shook his head, voice firm. "I had nothing to do with this. But if someone is trying to intimidate me, they're only proving my point, that this fight is about more than just grass and flags." Karen's gaze narrowed, but she said no more. The board voted to escalate the fines and threaten legal action. Harold left the meeting shaken but defiant. Outside, a sudden chill hung in the air. He felt eyes watching from the shadows, the tension crackling like static electricity. As he wheeled home beneath a darkening sky, a strange sense of foreboding settled in his chest. In Maplewood Heights, the battle lines were drawn. And Harold. Jenkins was no longer just fighting the HOA. He was fighting an invisible war where trust was scarce and danger lurked behind every perfect facade. The days after the HOA showdown felt like a slow burn, each moment thick with unease. Harold's world had shifted from quiet resilience to constant vigilance. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside set his nerves on edge. The battle for his home had escalated beyond paperwork and polite protests. It was becoming something darker. Early one morning, Harold's peaceful routine was shattered. He awoke to the sound of shattering glass. Heart pounding, he wheeled himself toward the living room, where the front window lay smashed, jagged shards glittering on the carpet. A small rock had been hurled through the glass, and pinned to the broken window frame was a note. "Last warning. Fix your yard or leave." Harold's hands trembled as he carefully removed the note. Fear mingled with anger. This wasn't just an HOA enforcement issue anymore. It was intimidation, plain and simple. He called Mrs. Dalton, who arrived within minutes, clutching a flashlight and a fierce determination. Together, they inspected the damage, and Mrs. Dalton promised to alert the neighbors. That afternoon, a gathering formed outside Harold's home, neighbors with concerned expressions, whispering about the break-in. Some offered help, others looked away, afraid to get involved. The community was fractured, tension palpable in the air. Karen, however, showed no sign of concern. The next HOA letter was harsher, detailing a mounting list of violations and announcing an imminent legal proceeding against Harold, demanding he pay fines totaling thousands of dollars within 10 days. Harold's mailbox overflowed with notices, each more menacing than the last. The phrase property value protection was repeated like a mantra, a justification for the escalating persecution. Then came the phone calls, anonymous, filled with heavy breathing, silence, or veiled threats. Harold's nights became restless, haunted by shadows and doubts. Despite the pressure, Harold remained defiant. He reached out to a local veterans advocacy group, sharing his story and the mounting harassment. The group offered legal advice and moral support, encouraging him not to back down. One evening, as Harold prepared for bed, he noticed something unusual on his security camera feed. A dark vehicle parked silently across the street, its headlights off. The car stayed there for hours, watching. Harold alerted the police, but officers found no one when they arrived. The feeling of being hunted grew stronger. In the midst of the turmoil, a mysterious letter arrived, handwritten, unsigned, and cryptic. Maplewood isn't what it seems. Look deeper. They're watching. Stay safe. Harold's mind raced. Who had sent it? A neighbor? An ally? Or someone with a hidden agenda? Determined to uncover the truth, Harold began piecing together the puzzle. The HOA's rigid enforcement was just the surface. Beneath it lay secrets, old grudges, hidden alliances, perhaps even corruption. Late one night, Harold found himself drawn back to the camera footage. He noticed subtle movements, figures in the shadows, fleeting glimpses of faces just beyond recognition. The battle for his home was no longer a simple neighborhood dispute. It was a war of wills, shadows, and secrets. And Harold Jenkins was right in the eye of the storm. Harold's days had turned into a relentless vigil. The mystery letter weighed heavily on his mind, gnawing at his sense of reality. Who was warning him? And what was hidden beneath the shiny surface of Maplewood Heights? Determined to find answers, Harold began digging into the neighborhood's history. He spent hours at the local library and online, pulling up old records, HOA minutes, and property deeds. The further he delved, the more tangled the web became. What first appeared to be a simple, overbearing HOA was actually a tightly knit circle of powerful families who controlled the neighborhood with an iron grip. They had their own interests, secret. Real estate deals, undisclosed fees, and covert plans to push out residents who didn't fit their ideal mold. Among the documents, Harold found references to a decades-old scandal involving a developer and suspicious land acquisitions. More chilling was a name that kept appearing, Karen Whitman's family. It seemed her influence ran deeper than anyone had realized. That night, Harold shared his findings with Mrs. Dalton and Lisa during a clandestine meeting in his dimly lit living room. The women exchanged worried glances, but agreed to help. They were neighbors no longer just caught in petty disputes, but trapped in a hidden war. Karen's not just enforcing rules, Lisa whispered. She's protecting something, or someone. Harold nodded grimly. And whoever's behind this will stop at nothing to keep it buried. The next day, Harold noticed new signs of surveillance, small drones hovering silently over his property, unfamiliar cars idling nearby. The intimidation was escalating, but so was his resolve. Late one evening, Harold received a phone call with a distorted voice. The message was brief, chilling. Stop digging, or you'll disappear like the others. Harold's blood ran cold. Disappear? Others. The words echoed in his mind, each syllable heavy with threat. But fear was no longer an option. With Mrs. Dalton and Lisa's help, Harold reached out to a local investigative journalist known for exposing corruption. The journalist agreed to look into the story, promising discretion and support. Together, they began planning a way to expose the truth, gathering evidence, interviewing neighbors, and documenting the harassment. The risk was enormous, but so was the potential payoff. As Harold prepared to confront the dark heart of Maplewood Heights, he felt a new strength rising within him. The fight was no longer just for his yard or his rights. It was for justice, for his community, and for the truth that refused to be silenced. But in the shadows, eyes watched, waiting. Karen Whitman was not the only player in this deadly game, and Harold's discoveries were about to ignite a chain reaction that would change everything. The atmosphere in Maplewood Heights had shifted. What once seemed like a quiet neighborhood dispute had spiraled into something far more dangerous, a silent war played in shadows and whispers. Harold Jenkins felt the weight of every eye upon him, every suspicious glance, every furtive movement in the dark. Days before the next HOA meeting, tensions reached a boiling point. Harold's phone buzzed relentlessly with anonymous texts, threats, warnings, and cryptic messages designed to unnerve him. But among the digital harassment came a surprise, a voicemail from the investigative journalist. The voice was cautious but urgent. "We found something, Harold. Financial records tying Karen Whitman and the HOA board to an illegal scheme. Fraud, intimidation, even bribery. This goes all the way to the city council." Harold's heart pounded. This was the breakthrough they needed, but with the truth came danger. The night before the HOA meeting, Harold found his front yard vandalized, his wheelchair ramp splattered, with red paint and a hateful message scrawled across the porch. "Leave now or suffer." The damage was more than symbolic. It was a declaration. Despite the fear, Harold refused to back down. When the day of the meeting arrived, the community hall was packed tighter than ever. The mood was electric, charged with uncertainty and anticipation. Karen Whitman appeared more defiant than ever, her eyes cold and sharp. But Harold noticed something unusual. She was guarded, even nervous. The board members whispered among themselves. Glancing frequently toward the door, Harold's allies, Mrs. Dalton and Lisa, sat close by, offering quiet support. The investigative journalist was there too, blending into the crowd with a notebook ready. As the meeting commenced, Harold took a deep breath and stood. "I'm here to present evidence, proof of corruption and intimidation by the HOA board." Hush fell over the room. Karen scoffed loudly. "Baseless accusations from a disgruntled tenant. This is an attempt to destroy our community." But then the journalist stepped forward, distributing copies of financial documents and email exchanges. Murmurs turned into gasps as the room absorbed the depth of the corruption. Neighbors who had once avoided Harold now looked at him with respect, some with fear. The community's fragile facade cracked wide open. Karen's face flushed with rage. "This is slander. I demand this meeting be adjourned." Before the chaos could erupt, the front doors burst open. Uniformed officers stepped inside, holding a warrant. The city council had launched an investigation based on the journalist's findings. The room erupted into confusion. Karen tried to protest, but the officers moved quickly, collecting evidence and securing the premises. Harold felt a surge of triumph mixed with disbelief. After months of intimidation, threats, and fear, justice had finally arrived. But just as relief washed over him, a sudden commotion broke out at the back of the hall. A masked figure lunged toward Karen, wielding a gun. Gasps and screams filled the room. In a split second, a shot rang out. The figure collapsed. Silence fell like a shroud. Harold's mind reeled. Who was the attacker? Was this linked to the corruption? And what about the innocent neighbors caught in the crossfire? As police secured the scene, Harold realized the fight was far from over. The truth had sparked a firestorm, and now, darkness threatened to consume them all. Maplewood Heights was no longer just a neighborhood. It was a battleground. and Harold Jenkins was at the heart of it. The silence that followed the gunshot was suffocating. Hearts pounded, breaths caught in throats. The masked attacker lay motionless on the floor, blood pooling beneath. Karen Whitman's eyes were wide, not with fear, but with a dark, calculating fury. Harold sat frozen in his wheelchair, overwhelmed by the chaos unfolding before him. Police swarmed the hall, securing the scene, while neighbors huddled in shock. The journalist whispered urgently to officers, offering her collected evidence. Minutes later, Detective Ramirez approached Harold with a solemn expression. "Mr. Jenkins, we need to talk." The community hall emptied slowly, the weight of the night settling heavily on everyone. Outside, flashing red and blue lights painted the dark streets in stark contrast. Harold was escorted to a quiet room where Detective Ramirez laid out the facts. The attacker was identified as Mark Pearson, a former HOA board member who had been mysteriously removed months ago. His motives were murky, but the investigation revealed a web of personal vendettas and desperation. Karen, it seemed, had her own secrets. Financial records and emails uncovered by the journalist exposed her as the mastermind behind many of the HOA's harsh tactics. But there was more. Karen had been siphoning funds to cover gambling debts, using intimidation to silence those who got too close. Harold felt a bitter satisfaction. His nightmare had exposed a deeper rot. But the detective's next words chilled him. "We also found evidence that someone tried to frame you for the break-in at your house. It wasn't random vandalism. It was orchestrated." Harold's mind flashed to the smashed window and the threatening note. Someone close to Karen had tried to break him, but he had stood firm. As dawn broke over Maplewood Heights, news spread quickly. Karen Whitman was arrested, along with several board members involved in the scheme. The city council promised a full investigation and restructuring of the HOA. Neighbors who had once feared speaking out now gathered around Harold's home, offering apologies, support, and friendship. The community was wounded but hopeful. Harold's wheelchair ramp, once vandalized, was repaired by a group of volunteers, a symbol of resilience and unity. Yet, as the dust settled, Harold knew the fight had changed him. The battle for his home had become a fight for truth, justice, and dignity. Not just for himself, but for every neighbor who deserved respect. One afternoon, as Harold sat on his porch, Lisa approached with a small package. Inside was a letter, handwritten, unsigned. "Thank you for standing strong. Maplewood is safer because of you." Harold smiled, a mix of gratitude and resolve warming his heart. The shadows had receded, but vigilance remained. Maplewood Heights would never be the same, but neither would Harold Jenkins. He was more than a disabled veteran in a wheelchair. He was a symbol of courage in the face of darkness. And as the sun set on the neighborhood, Harold knew one thing for sure. No matter what came next, he would never be silenced again.